Sup, you beautiful comrades, and welcome back to another What I Read video. Let's get started. First off, in the month of October, I finished reading the annotated Arabian Knights, translated by Yasmin Seal. To put it bluntly and succinctly, Arabian Nights is classic literature and should be adored as such. As far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be reading this book in English, you should be reading Yasmin Seal's translation. Yasmin Seal should honestly just translate every book from now on. I don't care if she doesn't speak every language. Next up, I read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, I would say, an iconic figure within the world of communism, having helped lead Russia out of the era of peasants and masters. The very first thing that I can possibly say about this book is that it is stuffy. Fortunately, it makes up for its stuffiness by being quite short. What he does is cite a lot of capitalist sources from the time and showcase how capitalism in every situation is leading towards monopolies, and through monopolies leading towards imperialism. And it's so relevant today. So this was a very good read. Here's a little portion that I'll read for you that I liked. In 1907, the German and American trusts concluded an agreement by which they divided the world between themselves. Competition between them ceased. The American General Electric Company got the United States and Canada. The AEG got Germany, Austria, Russia, Holland, Denmark, Switzerland, Turkey, and the Balkans. Special agreements, naturally secret, were concluded regarding the penetration of subsidiary companies into new branches of industry, into new countries formerly not yet allotted. The two trusts were to exchange inventions and experiments. It's easy to understand how difficult competition has become against this trust, which is practically worldwide, which controls a capital of several billion, and has its branches, agencies, representatives, connections, etc. in every corner of the world. Then I read a tiny little novella called A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers. This book is really heartwarming and short and sweet, a good book to pick up from the library and then have a cup of tea with while you read it. Next up, I read Moomin, the deluxe anniversary edition by Tove Jansson. Tove Jansson, of course, created the Moomin Trolls. She wrote a series of novels about the Moomin Trolls, and then she also made a comic strip. This book compiles all of her comic strip stories which she wrote. These comic book stories are hilarious. It's stuff like that that makes that book a delight to read, and so I am very delighted to have read that book. I started reading exemplary novels by Miguel de Cervantes. I was exposed to Cervantes through the same way that anybody would be exposed to him, Don Quixote, and I read the translation by Edith Grossman, and it was wonderful, probably one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. And I found out that Edith Grossman also translated exemplary novels, and I was very excited to dive in and get some more Cervantes. And I was reading these stories, and these stories were wonderful. Nothing too groundbreaking, just like love tales. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was alive in the 1600s and was devoutly Catholic, so I wasn't really expecting these stories to be like groundbreaking or anything. I was just reading them for their kind of adorableness. But then I stumbled across a story that was so horrendously bad that I had to stop reading the book, and it made me question Cervantes' whole legacy. So I don't know, I guess spoiler warning if you had exemplary novels by Miguel de Cervantes on your to-read list and you don't want one of the stories spoiled to you a little bit, turn away and plug your ears for like a minute. So the awful story in this book is called The Novel of the Power of Blood. What takes place in the story is simply this. A young woman is abducted and assaulted by a rich man. She then returns to her parents' house in shame and has to give up any presence in society in order to preserve her honor. She gives birth to a baby in secret. When the baby is 7 years old, he is found by an elderly couple who fall in love with this boy, and they invite her to come meet them, and she goes there and realizes that their son's room is the room where she was assaulted. So she tells the elderly couple that this boy that they like so much is actually their grandson, and she confesses that their son assaulted her. Do they send for the authorities? No. Instead, they orchestrate a wedding between their son and the woman so that her honor is restored, and at the end of the day, it's a happy ending because she's in love with their rapist son now. I couldn't handle a story like that. There's even a dialogue between the rich son and his mother where she tries to set him up with a woman who is deemed wise, but he looks at her and says, she's not beautiful. And Mom, I have enough wisdom for both me and my wife, and I have enough wealth for both me and my wife. So the only thing that I'm lacking is beauty. I just want somebody beautiful. So if you can't set me up with somebody beautiful, then I'm not interested in getting married. And that's when she brings in the woman that he assaulted. And it's insane. Moving on to the next book I read, which was Comet in Mland by Tove Jansson. Comet in Mland is really cute, it's really gorgeous, but it's also intensely dark. This book came out in 1946. We're talking about right after World War II. And this book is very clearly addressing the fear that a child might have of being bombed. For myself, for a lot of us in the United States, living in the heart of empire, we have never experienced the fear that bombs are dropping on us indiscriminately. So it's very easy for us to forget that that is currently actively happening the world over because of the United States. Thinking about the children in Palestine or Lebanon or Yemen or Syria or Iran right now, suddenly you would have to grasp that there are children actively experiencing the agony and the terror of not knowing when bombs might be falling above them. And suddenly a book like this hits insanely hard and is really devastating. So I'm really impressed with Tove Jansson's ability to create a cute, whimsical story that also happens to address one of the most dark and devastating things that you could imagine, which is the fact that mothers and fathers and children are being bombed in Palestine right now because of the United States. So at this point in the month, it actually really genuinely clicked in me that this month is October, and I wanted to get into the spooky season this year. I wanted to watch scary movies and read spooky books. Anyways, I tried to read Dracula by Bram Stoker. If anything, I think that I could have gotten all the way through this book if this book was like 100 pages shorter. I will say this about Dracula, there are very clear instances where you can see that this book is a man trying to write women, and it is laughably bad. This is one woman in a letter to another woman saying, "A woman ought to tell her husband everything. Don't you think so, dear? And I must be fair. Men like women, certainly their wives, to be quite as fair as they are. And women, I am afraid, are not always quite as fair as they should be." So just a woman slandering the entire gender. That's crazy. In another letter from one woman to another, our dear woman writes, "My dear Mina, why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them?" Tell me that does not sound like the biggest incel of all time writing a book. Next up, I read The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. I've read this book before. I'm just doing a reread as I go through the pillars of communist literature. If there's one thing I will share with you, it's his definition of the proletariat, because I think he cooks here. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and, consequently, all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance, and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. The Communist Manifesto is so good. I do think that it would benefit a bit from a more modern translation, possibly, but this is fine too. Next up, I finished Journey to the West West Revised Edition, Volume 3. The Journey to the West series as a whole is officially starting to drag for me. This is a very long set of books, and it's very repetitive. This book, though, does have some of the most iconic moments that we've seen in the Journey to the West story so far, including an entire city of just women, which is iconic. Are you kidding me? This is a pillar of Chinese literature, and they're already dropping feminist literature on us. Next up, in my venture to read spooky books for Halloween, I tried reading so many, and I only actually accomplished to finish one, and it was The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is the sequel to Interview with a Vampire, and I wanted to read this because I started watching the Interview with a Vampire show that's on Netflix that I think AMC is making, because that show seems kind of good. And this book is really good, except for the fact that there are a few times where I find it a bit questionable, where it seems like the vampires are trying to paint this picture of the Western world as if it is always moral and always cares about human life in every instance, and that is observably, demonstrably false, even within the Interview with a Vampire book itself. The first Interview with a Vampire includes Southern slavery. I don't think that you can make the argument that the Western world cares for human life in every or any instance, really. There was a little section right at the very start of this book where Lestat watches the movie Apocalypse Now and talks about how that movie is the classic tale of the Western world versus evil. And that had me pausing like, ugh, what are you talking about? You really think that's what the Vietnam War was? But then Lestat goes on to consider to himself that the Western world is against him, therefore he aligns with the evil. So then I was like, okay, so now it sounds like Lestat is comparing himself to the Viet Cong communists, which, if that's the case, I'm all in. Anyways, I tried to read this book, Hangs a Man by Shirley Jackson. I was kind of really excited to read this one, and it does have a really strong start with this young girl living through a very basic sort of family life situation of a toxic father preparing for a Sunday house party, but she was being plagued by visions of a detective questioning her about a murder or something. And so when a weird man started talking to her at the party, I thought that the story was going to go that she was getting premonitions of what was to come because she was going to kill the weird man. Instead, what happened was SA. And as far as I'm concerned, I am not interested in reading a horror book where the trope of the book is somebody got assaulted. I tried to read this book called The House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. The trope of this book is that, like, it's weird. Like, it's like, yeah, look at that. What is going on there, right? It's like a horror book, but pages have weird stuff going on. Footnotes, there's stuff written upside down. The premise is an old man dies and they find in his little apartment a book that he's written that's basically like a research paper about a documentary of a haunted house. And it's found by this young guy who works at a tattoo parlor, has a screwboy friend who's always trying to take him out in the middle of the night to get drunk every night and party and go to clubs. Somehow, this guy gains access to this old man's weird work and edits it, organizes it, finds translations for the stuff in other languages, organizes all the footnotes, and adds footnotes of his own in which he details his weird friends and his attempted sexcapades and things like that. And I frankly just find it unbelievable because I don't believe that this young tattoo parlor guy would actually take the time to organize this mess. On the whole, a lot of people in reviews will tell you that this is like a deeply unsettling book. It feels a little bit too overstuffed just for the sake of being overstuffed. It feels like somebody was trying to do like a David Foster Wallace Infinite Jest type thing. I already went through my David Foster Wallace phase and I'm thankfully out of it now. And there were other horror books that I tried to read this year that I did not get very far in at all. I think I did like 2 chapters of The Pet Cemetery. I'm really just not that crazy about reading Stephen King, maybe. Currently, I have The Queen of the Damned, which is the next book in the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles series. And I'm also officially working on The Two Towers because I believe that Lord of the Rings should be read in the fall amongst the tumblingst of the leaves. In terms of the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles novels, I am aware of controversy surrounding Anne Rice and things that she has potentially said because of the fact that she was raised within the Catholic Church. She was then atheist for many years. Then a lot of very sad things happened to her, like losses of family, at which point she came back to the faith, and maybe she has kind of renounced all of these vampire books that she wrote. My plan with the Vampire Chronicles books is I'm simply going to read them until I feel like it gets too cringe. But as long as it's good, as long as it's delightful, I am going to keep reading it. Like in the Vampire Lestat, there are descriptions of him turning into a vampire, or him turning somebody else into a vampire, or him chugging blood, and it is the most sexy thing you've ever read. It is just like appallingly, delightfully, deliciously sexy. Like, you might want to read it. If that sounds like your cup of tea for this Halloween, which is over by the time you're watching this probably, yeah, it's technically a delight. There's even a sort of reveal at one point that basically all of the gods that we've worshipped as mortals have been vampires. Like Jesus Christ returning from the dead. He returns from the dead because he was turned into a vampire. And I find that to be so delightfully sacrilegious. I mean, that is good. That is just like, in terms of world building, excellent. And I think that that's all that I've read and all that I care to say about all that I've read. Be sure to subscribe so that you can see all the books that I read next month. Also, please check out the description of this video where you will find a link to my inkitt page where you can read my personal writings. I am uploading my books for free on inkitt for your enjoyment. They're just rough drafts. It's just old stuff that I've written at this point, but I do think that as I fill that out, there should be some good things that you can read on there. Create an account, download the app. You can leave comments for me. You can follow me on there. Thank you for watching. Editing Brandon here because I completely forgot to mention that I am currently reading Blood in My Eye by George Jackson, and there's one portion of this book that I do find to be extremely relevant, especially now when we're 5 days away from a major election in which both of the two corporate fascist parties have promised that they will continue the genocide of the Palestinians. George Jackson was a revolutionary, and he writes here, "When any election is held, it will fortify rather than destroy the credibility of the power brokers. When we participate in this election to win instead of disrupt, we're lending to its credibility and destroying our own. With all the factors of control over the electoral process in the hands of the minority ruling class, the People's Party can always be made to seem isolated, unimportant, even extraneous. If these tactics still give the appearance of revolution to some after decades of miscarriage, we are justified in replacing them as vanguard."